Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And this is part 2 of a series on Christian nationalism. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I encourage you to do so. It's kind of necessary to understand where we're going from here. Today, we're going to talk about the negative aspects of Christian nationalism. And it's a phrase, by the way, obviously, when you hear it, when you see it quoted in an article or when you see it on a headline, it's almost certainly being used in the sense in which we're going to explore it today, I think. So we want to talk about some of those elements that really do give us pause. So I mentioned in the last episode, Nathan, that we are at a civilizational moment. I'm borrowing a phrase from our friend Os Guinness. Most people recognize that we're at a point of real cultural crisis. And so, the stakes are very high. And that tends to push us into directions we wouldn't have thought we would go. And so this is true of a lot of Christians as well. So I want to steel man this, Nathan, if I can. And that way, I think that's just an act of intellectual hospitality, and so we're going to do it. And so I think the thinking, broadly speaking, when it comes to forms of Christian nationalism that are, I think, ultimately harmful, goes something like this. Look, we're facing real civilizational threats. We are facing the possible, not only, expansion of abortion laws, but the possible, maybe this will include infanticide at a certain point, late-term abortions. We're facing, an increasingly aggressive attacks on the family and on marriage. We're facing sex education that's being foisted in our school systems. We're facing the sexualization of our children. So these are very, very serious issues. And
hang on. Those are
Christianity.
You're just in the moral categories. You're just in the moral categories there. If you want to bump that up to the national level, then you would say broadening global conflict, uncertainty about how our country is going to or not going to interact with other countries, questions about the border, about finances, about economy, about energy sovereignty or not energy sovereignty, all sorts of global disruptions and protest over food and the production of food. We could make it worse, is all I'm saying. Like, you gave us a nice little moral category there, but then I think on the nation state side, there are people who have significant worries there as well.
And so
now some of those I think are a bit overblown, but some of them aren't. So
some are, some aren't. And things are pretty serious. Things are pretty dire. So that's real. So some people would say that in the past, we have, Christianity has had enough clout to be able to have a real seat at the table. And we had the luxury of being persuasive. We no longer have that luxury now. Christianity has been pushed out from all the centers of influence effectively. The culture war has been lost. And so we need to be thinking strategically and carefully about what to do now that we don't have that kind of clout anymore. So I've seen some arguments along the lines of, I've seen the phrase cultural insurgency, that is what needs to be happening, and that we need to be building strategic fortresses. This is the language. So this is an article from, well, I'm actually not going to tell you where this article comes from. I'm sorry, but I don't want to give, I'm putting my cards on the table. I don't want to lend too much support to this particular website, which I think is doing more harm than good. But you could, if you Google those key phrases, you'll dig it up. You'll find it, Sherlock. You're good. You know what you're doing. Internets, Google it. But so we need to build fortresses. And one such fortress that's used as an example is in Moscow, Idaho. And some of you will know Moscow, Idaho, of course, is where Doug Wilson is. And Doug Wilson has, what do we call it, Nathan? It's not just a church. It's not really just a neighborhood. He's got a little kingdom there, doesn't he? And that this is kind of being pushed forward as a model for how we build these fortresses so that we can take back the culture. And of course, does this sound a little worrisome? I think it does. I mean, how precisely do you mean you take back? It's worth pointing out also that Canon Press, which is Doug Wilson's, that's his publishing house, has just put out the book. I mean, there are a couple of books on Christian nationalism that are circulating right now. One that is a for Christian nationalism book is I think it's just called Christian Nationalism by Christopher Wolfe. And Wolfe makes, I mean, among his arguments, this is a work of political philosophy. It's about 400 pages long. One of the arguments he makes is that we need a Christian prince, and he means prince in the Machiavellian sense, to see to it that we have a social order reestablished here in North America. He's got some other ideas in there that I think are very alarming as well. So this is what is causing people some serious concern.
Yeah, here's the hang up, Cameron. Let's just say this. So yeah. I was telling you, I was visiting some friends in Pennsylvania, and they opened up the Sunday paper, and they're like, oh, look at this. And here's a church who had taken out a full-page ad in the local newspaper on being anti-Christian nationalist, and we're denouncing Christian nationalism, and it was basically a chest thumping, I thank you, God, that I'm not like these people. And you're just like, what a bunch of virtue signaling. Right. Like, do you really think that there's a militia forming like over the hedge beside your church that's coming to wipe out all the democracies that they're, there's the biggest eye roll possible on the way in which the more liberal theology and liberal media talks about this that makes me almost not want to take any of it seriously. On the other hand, you do have people who are talking about forming militias and writing books like this. And so some of it is to the Christians who are caught up in it's like, you're making us look bad because you're actually giving credence to what I would consider to be more like a left-wing conspiracy theory at this point. But then again, here are some key data points throughout history. You have people who kind of offer the Christian call to arms. We're going to storm the Bastille and sort this out. So there you have it. I just want to say the awkwardness that the whole conversation.
That's my instinct too.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's my instinct too. So it's worth pointing out that, but see, I'm learning not to downplay as much as I have in the past. So on the one hand, yes, I see those headlines, and I don't have enough eyes to roll with them either. And what I'm describing are still, I mean, so the book by Christopher Wolfe happened to be a bestseller on Amazon. These are still fringe kind of movements. And I mean, I'm describing some percolations that have been happening
but the history of these movements is that they always have started like this and not stayed small. So we can look back across.
That's precisely the point. Yes.
That's the thing. Yeah.
That's the thing. And that's why I did. I'm not going to read Wolfe's entire book, but that's why I did read pretty big sections of it over the weekend. And I thought I do want to know. There's something. It's one thing if somebody's spouting ideas that I think are poisonous. It's another if they put together a carefully reasoned piece of political philosophy that runs in excess of 400 pages and has lots of footnotes. So that's a lot of time, trouble. This is a person who's appears to be at least standing on principle, has thought this out very carefully, and there's a market for it too. Now I'm describing percolations that have been happening in the Reformed neck of the woods, which is where I live. We could also talk about the integralist movement, which also I think is still, it's fringe, but again, right, within Catholicism. But you've got an increasingly influential group of people like Sohrab Ahmari and people like that who are carrying it forward and continuing to write very influential books and who are major public intellectuals. So and as things get more unsteady in America, these kinds of movements begin to gain more traction. So that's why we are paying some attention to it. I mean, I'll be honest, Nathan, my motives in looking at some of this was originally just to think, all right, I'm going to basically see how David French and Russell Moore are overblowing things, and then thinking, oh, wait, maybe they're not entirely overblowing things.
Okay,
Goodness.
well let's zoom out zoom out with me for a moment here, Cameron. What is the primary mode of cultural organization and structure that humans have gravitated toward? Let's just say in all of human history. Let's name a couple. Oh, let's think of emperors, kings, pharaohs, princes. Monarchy and theocracy are basically the two. Can you think of a different? I mean, even down to your native tribes and having chiefs and Vikings. I mean, all of them are dependent on a monarchy. One single, and archy, overarching ruling. A monarchy. You have theocracies, so like the theological structure becomes the leadership. I think Israel and Islam tried versions of that. You have oligarchies, oli being Greek for a few, so a few people ruling. There really aren't, like, across the spectrum of human history, democracy is not a huge component of human life. So let's just recognize that our tendency is to gravitate toward a monarchy. And what a monarchy allows is for you to have a strong man who dictates everything. And even in more totalitarian regimes that aren't necessarily a monarchy based off of like genealogy, they are highly efficient.
Yeah, but it's definitely the modern monarchy kind of. Yeah, that's a crude way of putting it, but the totalitarian sort of modernism's answer to a monarchy. Yeah.
So let's just say that that's the default position that humanity has gravitated toward. Even in the Old Testament, we want a king like every other nation. I mean, that was the argument, like every other nation. If that is true, that is our default, you actually only head in that direction in times when you see that there's a cultural crisis and we need somebody to come in and sort this out. So Israel's saying, look, we need a king like the other nations to defend us against our enemies.
We need a king. Yep. So and Samuel tells them exactly what'll happen. And they're like, yeah, bring it on.
And it is also interesting in that it says during the lifetime of Samuel, the Philistines, Israel was safe from the Philistines without a king. But anyway, I digress. The point I'm making is that in times of perceived cultural instability, the natural human inclination is to look for a strong man who will come in and will make your agenda happen universally. I'm just as far as I can tell.
That's right.
My degree is in physics, not history, but as far as I can tell, that is the standard. Step one, there's chaos. Step two, you recognize that we aren't going to get together. Step three, you start looking for a king and somebody who's going to be the strong man who makes sure that stability is achieved and your ideals are universalized. Now, with that in the back of our minds, let's continue this conversation.
Right. So the steel man here is desperate times call for desperate measures. I think that's really what it is. And to that, we've got to give some answers that are going to sound comparatively weak. And that is always the risk of Christianity, is that it doesn't sound persuasive in worldly terms. And now, that's a mark of its truth, I think, but it doesn't. Let's go ahead and be honest. I was reading a chapter on I've been obsessed with the kind of comic vision of history, that life is a grand commedia and not a tragedy. And one of the observations that one of these scholars made is that the God of Israel always sort of disappoints people because he's the God who doesn't want a war. He wants to talk, work these things out, speak through them. And so part of the catch here is that we have to make a distinction, first of all, between Christianity and that the Christianity and the values of Christianity, the virtue of Christianity that has nourished Western culture and civilization, and something like modern liberalism, which is, our current political order. I don't think it's not perfect, and it's a relatively new idea, and we can't take it for granted. But I think for the most part, I like it. I prefer.
I'm very happy to be here.
This. Yes, I'm happy to be here. I prefer this liberal order to what you see in, say, South Sudan or China, but it is distinct from Christianity. So the notion that the notion that, so one way to look at this
hang on.
that I think is misguided
you need to slow the horses way down there. And I think you're right.
Sure.
But you just made a leap that not many people do. So go back and differentiate between liberal democracy and Christianity as not being the same thing.
Well, I mean, liberal democracy is really committed to a notion of freedom that I think is basically good. We want freedom and we want liberty, but it's also, so my hangups have to do with the vision of freedom. I think we need to do some work on a more positive vision of freedom. We tend to conceive of freedom in negative terms these days and think about it just as freedom from all constraint. We're not as good on freedom to be something. And that's part of the problem there, is we can't agree on what a person is made, what human beings are for, and what we ought to be. Now, if we look to the Christian heritage there, which would tell us that all human beings are made in the image of God, well, there's a powerful start. There's a really powerful start.
Yeah, so okay, but is that
paradoxically, the liberal order is giving birth to some of our great. It's a source of, on the one hand, freedom and stability. On the other hand, it's leading to some of our deepest conflicts too. So you just made you forced me to make this more complicated.
But I think this is important, because this also explains why I think there's a growing sense of polarization. Everybody talks about there's a growing sense of polarization. Yeah. Think of it like this. Let's say that Thinking Out Loud as an organization said we're going to buy a bicycle. Which I can't think why our organization would need a bicycle right now, and it doesn't own any vehicles. If you want to know what you're doing with the money that you're donating toward us, it is not to buy bicycles. Anyway, let's say that we're going to buy a bicycle, and Cameron says, I think we should have a red bicycle, and Nathan thinks, I vote we have a blue bicycle, and you and I are having a conversation about what color bicycle would best serve the needs that we have. That's two different perspectives pursuing a common vision to buy a bicycle.
Right.
What it feels like now, and historically, maybe you would say, and to use America as an example here, is you had a vision for the country, and you had Democrats and Republicans and independents, and everybody had the same vision of where we're going. It was just a question of what is the best way to get to that destination.
How do we get there? Yeah.
How do we get there? And so it's a conversation about, like, do we take the scenic route, or do we go through the urban area and stop at all the red lights? Whatever. But we're trying to get to the same place, where now people say, actually, we're not trying to get to the same place anymore. And so if you look at the increase in polarization, it's because there isn't a common vision anymore of saying, this is fundamentally what we all care about as part of what it means to be part of this country. And since we have different visions, now we're just fighting over whose vision is powerful enough to overtake the other vision and impose that on the other person. And so Christianity historically, nationally provided a sense of vision and virtue of some of the ideals that we were aspiring to. Footnote the Declaration of Independence, I would say. But now that we don't really have that common vision of where are we trying to go, that's what leads to this sense of polarization. So I want to pull that back into what you were saying of how Christianity doesn't really work as Jesus wasn't giving the outline. There's giving the outline of like how to vote or how to build an empire. He was more casting the vision of how to live rightly before God and each other, which does create a stabilizing influence within a nation, but it doesn't give us the concrete tools that we would like it to give us for and this is how you build that nation.
So let me give you an example that I think is pertinent here and very powerful. And it's not mine. This comes from Ayaan Hirsi Ali. We've been quoting her a lot lately. Here she is again. She says, read the biography of Muhammad and look at what he did in his early years. When he began to claim that he had a vision from God. What did he do? For about, I think it was a year or 2 years, he did religious stuff. He went door to door. He worked to persuade people, and nothing happened. And then he turned to the sword. And so here's what she says. She goes, what does that tell you? It tells you that he was not very persuasive. the goodness and the beauty of and the allure and the of the vision he painted, the religious vision he painted, was not persuasive to people at all. But then he turned to the sword, and she says, and that was very persuasive. Christianity, if you look at its history, it is not without its faults in history. Human beings make massive mistakes, and this is why we need to not turn a blind eye to the moments when the church has gone drastically wrong in its abuse of power. But when Christianity has been true to its Lord and his word, it has won and it has conquered through persuasion, not through the sword. And so you think about the beginnings of Christianity. Christians are the first time we see Christians show up in as a word, it's in Acts chapter 11, I think. You have this little sect and then dispersed throughout the Roman Empire, become this global revolution with us to this day. This is that historical, that continuation, that preservation down, that transmission down the ages. That's part of, actually, that's an argument. The first person I heard who made a very powerful, shaped that into an apologetic argument recently was David Bentley Hart with his book Atheist Illusions. But that's the vision that Tom Holland gives us in Dominion as well. But it's through persuasion. So Jesus, when we look at him in the New Testament, and if you're looking for some kind of, like you said, Nathan, clear-cut political program or some manual for empire building, it's a very frustrating exercise. What he's giving you is a vision of moral transformation in your life. Mm-hmm. And then on the basis of that moral transformation, which really involves in its basic outworkings, you loving God with all that you are and then loving your neighbor as yourself, on the basis of that transformation, you can see massive, massive political and societal benefits.
Mm-hmm, sure.
But, yeah. And so but in a word, Christianity works through, when it's put to when coercion is introduced, you get something that's not Christian anymore.
There's a great line. I can't remember the original quote. I think I ran across it in Alan Kreider's book, The Patient Ferment of the Early Church, which is a fascinating read. The thesis is that for the first 400 years, the most discussed topic by the church fathers was patience. But he's using, he's quoting somebody else. So this was a time in which the church had no political power, right? It wasn't even an option to try for. But he's quoting somebody else, and I don't have the name, but the idea. So he's using Hercules as a stand-in for the Greco-Roman system of control and power, and he's using. So the quote is, "The lanky shepherd of Galilee wrestled Hercules and won." So the lanky shepherd of Galilee wrestled Hercules and won. And so when you set up that idea of Jesus as a disappointment because he doesn't come with the sword versus the masculine, the powerful ideal of Hercules, the statement is like, how did the lanky shepherd of Galilee end up beating Hercules as an enduring and cultural influence? There's another idea that goes alongside that. I can't remember what book this is from, of saying there was a time in which there were saber-toothed tigers and white clover on this planet. So you envision saber-toothed tiger, gigantic predator, big teeth. And then the humble little white clover that every animal that's an herbivore loves to eat. There are not saber-toothed tigers anymore. There's white clover in my backyard. Mm-hmm. And so it's setting up this odd thing of that sometimes this is the counterintuitive thing of the gospel, is that sometimes the thing that doesn't draw its sword outlasts the thing that does. Now, persecution is real and sometimes it doesn't, but as an overall structure, we just got to point out there's that part of it.
Well,
of what Jesus said.
We do, and we have to linger here for a second, because there's been a lot of talk lately among some very smart Christians about how winsomeness is not good and how persuasion is not really necessarily good, not in the winsome sense at least, and how we need to do away with these because they're not effective strategies. And again,
effective strategies
everything
for what?
That you just said, Nathan. Well, sure. Well, it depends on, for winning in a certain sense, right? Mm-hmm. winning the culture in the sense of controlling. Yeah, so that's why it's helpful to go back to what you said earlier about we look to the primal forms of government that have been we gravitate toward most down the ages and in times of crisis, some form of monarchy or some absolute form of control. In times of crisis, this is what tests the mettle of what your actual principles are. So let's sit down and talk this through is always going to look weaker in times of crisis than I'll cut your head off. And I mean, times are very serious. Yeah. And so, I mean, in primitive terms, Muhammad's answer is, okay, fine. Talking's not working. I'll cut your head off. And as Ali says, that is very persuasive. Yeah. Yes, it is. But Christianity is really, when we look at it, now we got to get past the civilizational benefits to do this, though, Nathan, and to talk about it. The Christianity is all about reaching the heart of a person. You're not going to reach a person's heart by cutting their head off. No sword's going to reach a person's heart. And this is where you see the supernatural work that has to be taking place as well. Because when we're actually talking about reaching hearts, we're reliant on the Holy Spirit. And here's where I think we get to the crux of the issue, Nathan. During times of crisis, the major temptation is also to say we're on our own. We got to figure this out. This is why we gravitate toward, we need a strong man. We need a prince. We need a Christian prince. We don't need Jesus. We do need Hercules, because Jesus doesn't understand things are complicated right now. Have they seen, this curriculum they're trying to teach our children? Have they seen, look at the economy, look at everything we're dealing with, look at this conflict that we're about to, we're poised for some sort of worldwide conflict. We need answers, practical answers. But once again, and we're not alone. We serve the living God, and we are dependent and reliant on Him. Now, I think let me just meddle for 1 second here, and because I think this will bring us to a constructive place. Why are we in such cultural disarray? I have the benefit now of pointing to somebody else who said this. I didn't say it. Peter Hitchens said it, and Peter Hitchens is Mr. Polemicist extraordinaire. But he'll say things like, "Oh, I'm not going to imitate Peter Hitchens because he's too eloquent. I can't do it." But he'll say, I'm not too worried about, gay marriage and all of these, new innovations. I think that's a drop in the bucket. What I'm deeply concerned about and have been is the desecration of actual marriage. And he traces that to no-fault divorce. And he basically says that has been catastrophic on a societal level, because it's the big building block of a civilization, and the stability that comes from marriage as authored by God. When that was fundamentally disrupted and that covenant was completely vandalized, that's where he sees true and serious, radical, fast-moving breakdown happening. I think he's right. So I think we've got some.
There's a book called "I'm a Christian Now What." I think it's Andrew Armstrong. Armstrong is definitely the last name, but he points out in there that in modern America, you have more of a legal obligation to your landlord than to your spouse. It's easier to get out of it's easier to get out of your marriage than it is out of a rental agreement in the United States.
Yep, and that's precisely it. And Peter Hitchens uses that very, very example. Well, that I don't think we've paid sufficient. So, in other words, I'm not saying this because I want people to feel terrible, and I'm saying that because we have a tendency to think, oh, we need some vast political solution. We need some strong man. And we're not saying this is not a recipe of quietism, sit on your hands and don't do anything. But we're saying the real difference that Christianity makes begins with deep inward transformation.
Okay, but
we've got
Here's what you're saying, though, is that a desire for militant Christian nationalism is a shortcut. And so let me pick on one of my kids.
Yes.
We're digging potatoes in the fall, and one of them is complaining and says, "What we need is a robot to do this." And I say, "No, what we need is for you to stop whining and put the potatoes in the basket." So one of those is here's a shortcut. There's another way we could do this. It'd be easier. And the other is like, no, actually, there's some work that we have to do in other categories before, that, I mean, it would be neat to have a robot that can pick potatoes, but I mean, there are other machines for that. But
no, but you're right.
Another thing.
So he's going to write a book about you, but you're right.
There's a sense of, you can talk to your therapist about this later, like why we made you grow your own food. The sense here, though, is that I think we have to be very clear about what the problems really are facing us. So your Peter Hitchens example is a good one of saying, the church can get all up in arms about drag queen story hour, but is the church willing to also take very hard stances on other categories of marriage? We can, say,
well, Nathan,
this is why it's just easier to outsource it to somebody else to sort it out for us, because it gets meddling.
Well, yes, right, and think about a line like, "They will know you are mine by the love you have for one another." That's a very haunting phrase, because especially when you look at what's happened to marriage, when you look at how divided the church is in the United States right now, this is one of the reasons why Nathan and I both have reservations about an industry, a journalistic industry, where certain, noted Christian intellectuals spend a good deal of their time writing their opinion pieces about how terrible the church is. And again, that's not, and of course, let's give us, let's be in good faith here. We're not saying we shouldn't we shouldn't pay attention to hypocrisy and the things that are happening. Of course, we shouldn't deal with the mess in our own house, so to speak. Absolutely. But we need to be banding together and working together for the sake of Christ and for the sake of our neighbor, and yes, for the sake of our nation. But it has to start in our homes. So, and I know people will think, oh, but that's just so small. We need something bigger than that. There is nothing bigger than that. Well, there's nothing bigger than that.
Well, you also have to operate under the Christian paradigm that dying or being killed isn't the worst thing that could happen to you. We have to put those cards on the table as well.
We need some training on that one, because we have not thought sufficiently about that here in the West. Plenty of Christians worldwide are in a great position to teach us a lot right there. But in North America, we're pretty undertrained in thinking about what it means, how death is not the worst thing that could happen to us.
Yeah. In some of the conversations around Christian nationalism or integralism, the pushback is say, well, this is Machiavellian. And people say, oh, Machiavelli is being misunderstood. Nah, I went back and read some of the Prince recently. And he's giving instruction for princes on the most efficient way to maintain power. That's the language. The most efficient way to maintain power. So he said, so the end justifies the means. If the end is to maintain power, then you can justify any means in order to get to that end. And that's where we have to decide whether or not that's a form of idolatry. Is that, are we going to pursue power by any means? And if so, that's not Christian.
Yeah. And I think, Nathan, it's a classical intellectual maneuver these days when you also approach times of crisis to say something like, well, Machiavelli, I think, he's been misrepresented, and we need to look. There's some good stuff there. I've even, Nazism.
Look at the people who actually embody, who he was writing to, who took his ideas and lived them out. Like,
no, and I wish I could say I was giving people thought he meant. Well, and I wish I could say when I just made that Nazism comment that's me pulling an example out of a hat, but I'm not. Those are actual people who are making that argument. The place you could see a lot of this stuff unfold is unfortunately on the artist formerly known as Twitter, X. But what people will say, but it's there are some principles there. There were some, not all aspects of that political philosophy were completely wrong. They've been misrepresented and misapplied. This is a little bit of this is an intellectual sleight of hand that sometimes happens. It's deeply insidious. But again, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to say, take a peek through the Prince yourself. Look at it. It's good. you and I, Nathan, we're both ad fontes people. Go back to the source and look at it, and you can say, nope, this is pretty straightforwardly pernicious and wrong.
But then look at how it's been used.
Clearly, completely. Look at how it's been applied, and also, and completely, very obviously, a child could say this is foreign to Christianity. In no way can you. I mean, if you try to weld this onto, but so. Again, we don't want to speak too strongly there, but let's be careful on what we're paying attention to and what roads we're being led down.
What impulses is the desire for Christian nationalism foster? What is that based on? And Cameron, I have this in my own heart of like, I wish some things were more clear and more organized, and I wish we could just do this and this. And when you have those moments in your mind, that is when you have to stop and back up and say, what is driving this? And is this for the desire to be conformed to the image of Christ, or is this out of a fear for me and mine and what's mine? And that's a helpful thing to say, what's motivating this? The flip side of that is Jesus was not a pansy and wasn't a total pushover. And the kingdom of heaven is rapidly advancing and forceful men take hold of it. We're living in a time in which you hear the phrase, all that's required for evil to prevail is for good men to do nothing. And that largely is true, I think, but the assumption that you can't adopt is that the opposite of nothing is physical violence. There's a whole lot of room for other action in between there that needs to be talked about. And so I think I would...
Yeah.
Anyway.
No, serving your neighbor, loving God as best as you can with all that you are, taking care of your children, your families, that's not nothing. That's more than something. I'm like you, Nathan. I struggle with patience. I want the robot to pick up the potatoes myself. But I'm learning slowly by God's grace to do the part that he has for me, which, looks infinitesimally small when I look at these outsized challenges that face us, and then to leave the rest to God. And that's a recipe also for rest in your soul.
Yeah.
Not necessarily physical rest, but rest in your soul. And that's not quietism. That's not doing nothing. But yeah, the violent bear it away, or the violent take it by force. I think of violent bear it away has been immortalized by Flannery O'Connor, using it as a book title. But yet the temptation is always to find some shortcut. And patience really is a virtue we've got to recover here. And we need to, but also just the recognition that we rely on our Lord. We are dependent on him. We're not going to somehow pull this off. And again, that requires training, and that requires, a life of all the things that we're supposed to be doing anyway, of prayer, being steeped in God's word with his people. So yes, it's yeah.
You've got the little kid song. Think back to Bible school, Cameron. He's got the whole world in his hands, right? That requires a phenomenal amount of faith in times of crisis to believe that is true, but that it's not just that he has the whole world in his hands, but he's intimately involved in the comings and goings and the interactions of it. And, there was a point in my life, I think I was getting ready to fly to England or something, and I'll give you a grandpa quote here. So he's like, hey, stop in on your way to the airport. I want to talk to you about something. And he said, look, there was a time in my life where I thought, if all the Christians of the world just get their act together, we're going to stop all the wars, feed all the people, preach the gospel to everybody. And he made a pretty good run at it, from the refugee camps of Europe post-war down into the jungles of South America, and a whole fascinating life there. But there was a point in his life where he got overwhelmed with the task of trying to fix the world. And he said he was walking through some elephant grass in the jungle, and he just realized, I'm not going to be able to cover the whole earth, and the church isn't going to pull it off. And I'm not going to be able to I'm not going to be able to get my agricultural extension work to every part of everybody who's starving in this region. And I'm not going to be able to preach the gospel to everybody. And I'm not going to be able to, and I'm not going to be able to. And he's like, I laid down in the jungle and cried and had a pity party for myself. of what I wasn't going to be able to accomplish in life and what the church wasn't going to be able to pull off. And he said it was a very formative spiritual moment for him in which he very much felt like God was speaking to him, not audible voice, but deep conviction of his soul, where he said, and the Lord said to me, Dave, how about you be faithful to do the things I asked you to do, and I'll run the world. And so I think there's a good message for, I needed to hear that. And those of you who listen to this who are very competent, capable, hyper, go get them type people need to hear that as well, is you will not accomplish all the ideals that you have for yourself, for your family, for your neighborhood, for the world. But you're not called to. You're called to be faithful to what God is asking you to do, and then trust that he's going to weave those of us who are being obedient to the unfolding of his kingdom together in a way in which he actualizes his outcome for his glory and our neighbor's good, and we play a part in that. And so I'm not saying don't be strategic, don't be acting powerfully in the world, don't be dreaming and coming up with systems of thought. Like, go for it, full court press. The kingdom is advancing, forcible men take hold of it. Like, be part of that, but never confuse whose agenda you're working for, what the nature of that God is, and then don't get distracted by what's happening in another part of the world and miss out on what God is asking you to do today. So I think people could get frustrated with this podcast, this part 2 of the Christian Nationalism, where it says you're calling for quietism. Not true. Or that it's not practical. Not true. What we're calling for is Christian discipleship and obedience to say, let's let God quarterback the play. You run your route, whether the ball gets thrown to you or not. That is an important part of the play. It's just that you don't get to control the outcome of it. So therein lies, I think, it'd be great if we could elect the right robot to pick our potatoes for us, but that's not what God has in mind. What he has in mind is for you to be conformed to the image of the Son, and that's going to be a more challenging thing for us to do, but will, in effect, actualize God's plan when we set aside our selfish ambition, practice our own self-control, and daily pray, not my will, but thine be, but yours be, just as he taught us to pray in the prayer he taught his disciples, and then as he himself prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. So, not my will, but thine. That's what we're left with, I think, at the end of the day, not as a political strategy, but as a statement of discipleship and obedience to what Christ is asking of us. This is a complicated topic. It's not going away anytime soon. Go back and listen to part 1 if you haven't heard it. Pros, cons, challenges, warnings. We have our own history as a church on times in which we can look back and say, yeah, we missed it there. Let's press into that and learn from it, but let's also lean heavily on the things that Jesus taught us as we try to make sense of how to live well in this world as his disciples in tumultuous times, which turns out to be exactly what Jesus predicted the shape of the world would be, and exactly what he called us to when he walked among us. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.